All right, hi there, everyone. Welcome back. We are continuing. This week, we're going to be looking at virtue ethics. I know that this week is a lot. I just want to say really quickly, because we are looking at Kant, Kantian ethics, deontology, and Aristotle and virtue ethics. And there is a lot because whereas like we looked at act utilitarianism, rule utilitarianism, those things shared something in a way that these conceptions do not. So I know there's a lot going on. I'm willing to work with you on deadlines. That being said, we are going to continue now with our next thinker. So we're still looking at moral theories. We're in the world of normative ethics. We're trying to isolate things of intrinsic value. We've looked at a few theories, utilitarianism. And utilitarianism, I told you, has become one of the dominant moral theories in the last 200 years. And utilitarianism is considering itself with the consequences of an action. We thought about act utilitarianism, also called classic utilitarianism, as articulated by Jeremy Bentham, who was a thinker of the late 18th century going into the 19th century. Then we thought about his student John Stuart Mill, who of course made this theory. Mill makes the distinguishment between act and rule utilitarianism, takes on rule utilitarianism, and this has had a very palpable influence on Western society ever since he first articulated in this manner. What brings utilitarianism, though, together as a major theory is its focus on the consequences of action. It builds on that idea of hedonism, is also distinguishing the interest of people from their own self-interest that egoism did. And I mean, some of you have taken on this belief of utilitarianism and you think it's right, it tells you something. Then we had deontology. We studied Immanuel Kant. That was last video. That was obviously super a lot going on. Kant famously is complex and he has a lot going on in his theories, and unfortunately all of it seems to be kind of relevant to think about. But deont refers to duty, and that's because he thought at the level of our actions, the category actions are the type of category interested in those things that we have ethical obligation towards. So the thing that we looked at for deontology were actions themselves. Each act we have a duty towards, and the imperative, that is the thing that guides or calls attention to our behaviors, calls us to have those duties irrespective of those consequences. The example given was I could lie and say that my friend is not in this back room, right? And I might do that because I think the consequence of telling the truth and letting him back here would be that he murders my friend. But Kant thinks that actually ends up getting your friend killed. Lying would get your friend killed. And that's because the only thing we can rationally conceive of happens at this level of action. And that is where duties happen, right? Why are we talking about this? That's because it's actually super relevant to tell you more about the history of how all of this happens and why we care about any of this. Because there is a woman who I don't think was mentioned in our reading, but I think it's important to tell you her name because the only reason we talk about Aristotle's virtue ethics is because of her. But there is this woman named Elizabeth Anscombe. And Elizabeth was one of the first women philosophers, especially in the sense we think philosopher today. And she wrote this paper, I want to say it was 1958, but it takes off in Anglo-American philosophy, the philosophy of English speakers, really in the 60s and 70s. And she writes this paper called Modern Moral Philosophy, where she looks at this debate that, as I told you in our last lecture, has really been the debate that's defined ethics for the last 200 years. This debate between whether or not we should analyze the rightness or wrongness of our actions on the basis of the consequences of them or on the act themselves. And she says that we've lost something really important from ancient philosophy. So Anscombe writes, in the late 50s, I think, this major change in philosophy that is the only reason why we talk about virtue ethics today. Before Anscombe, the only people who even knew about virtue ethics or who talked about virtue ethics were scholars of ancient Greek philosophy. So, like, for example, in the ancient Greek world, Aristotle believed that there were four elements: air, water, earth, fire, in that everything in the world were these four elements interacting with one another. But of course, now we have this belief about cells and chemicals and atoms and elements, and we think there are more than four elements. There's over 100 elements, and you can look at them on the periodic table, and we've sort of disproven Aristotle's original conception of the elements of the universe. Virtue ethics which is the topic of this lecture, was one of these things. We sort of thought that utilitarianism and deontology displaced virtue ethics just as modern chemistry displaced Aristotle's conception of the elements of the universe, right? This woman named Elizabeth Anscombe identifies something really cool about virtue ethics using the language of teleological versus teleologist. Our author kind of talks about this, but I actually think that is a super dense philosophical distinguishment that we don't need to really articulate right now. But the fascinating observation made is something like this. Both of these actions are worrying about the act. That is, they care about the consequences of the act. I'll put act here to even be more clear. Consequences of the act, or they're thinking about the act itself. And both of these, for some reason, have been super, super dissatisfying, right? It's either the case that sometimes we end up doing things in pursuit of our goals that mean that we are going to be con men, or we are going to allow certain people to die, or there are going to be these really unintuitive spaces we find ourselves in that when Kant was articulating deontology as a response to utilitarianism, like some of those counter arguments seem to hold merit to us. There's a lot of problems that we faced with utilitarianism. And vice versa, deontology had its own host of unintuitive realities, and there was a lot of good counter arguments that problematized deontology. Right? To say that the action of eating a steak with a salad fork is actually less about the function of using the fork, but really a social interaction, and a consequence of our social interaction is the physical motion we do with our body, seems unintuitive, right? Or alternatively, that I am supposed to tell someone, oh, my friend is back here, and let them into my home to kill my best friend, that just seems really intellectually unappealing. It seems wrong to us. So these two things have a lot of flaws. And as all of you are probably realizing as you reflect on the decisions you made, I introduced that question, ethics, what should I do? I'll write it out. This is still what I think ethics is. Then we took this question and we were looking at, well, what should I do? These things called sweatshops exist. What should I do? I have the ability to think about lying as a clinician. What should I do? Euthanasia exists. What should I do? The trolley problem. What should I do? We kept looking at these examples. We kept looking at potential acts. We were analyzing what should we do with these acts. And so intuitively, we thought about the major tension, the major difference between it is we thought about the act itself, or we thought about the consequences of that action. That really was the kind of debate we saw. And it's true if you go back to those applied ethics videos, most of the arguments and the counter arguments between the two sides have to do with consequences of acts versus acts themselves, and which of these are permissible. Anscombe says, if we return to Aristotle, and if you don't know who Aristotle is, I would argue probably the most famous philosophers, if you don't count like Buddha or Jesus, the most famous philosophers who are not also religious figures really probably are the three famous philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates. Socrates was their teacher. Socrates had two very famous students, Plato and Aristotle, and these two famously disagreed with each other very intently. In fact, also part of why the author introduced the language of teleologist is because that was a direct contradiction to Plato's theory of forms. And so he's trying to make you think about philosophy a lot more than I really think is appropriate for an introductory level ethics class at a community college. So I really want to focus on the language of act. What Elizabeth Anscombe, though, identifies that makes virtue ethics interesting is instead of focusing on the act, it focuses on what we call the agent. The agent is the person who performs an act. This is the real distinction that's super cool, that makes utilitarianism and deontology different than virtue ethics. The preeminence of virtue ethics is still emerging. I think now, usually when philosophy programs start to get bigger, they usually have someone who teaches ancient Greek philosophy, and if there's an ethicist on there, they're going to teach virtue ethics. But for example, when I first studied ethics, I didn't learn about virtue ethics because the curriculum just didn't include it at Ohio State at that time, and that has since changed. And when I assumed this class, that was actually part of the curriculum, and that's part of why I'm teaching it. But this all really comes down to the observation of one woman who said, why these are so dissatisfying is because they don't ever think about the person who is doing the act in the first place. And that's going to be the subject of today's lecture, which is virtue ethics. And Aristotle is the thinker. Anscombe is just reading Aristotle and saying he's super relevant here. But why Anscombe thinks this is at all helpful is because she thinks this debate within moral philosophy that was happening, that we live in the wake of, and we really still do live in the wake of. We are only 200, less than 300 years at least, years removed from these two major schools of thought being at debate with each other in ethics. If there is at all a change that happened, people who think we have begun the postmodern era, that is the era after modern philosophy, if you think that that's happened, you actually think the debate is whether or not ethics exists at all. And we'll talk about that a little bit next week, so I'll hold my horses, but we certainly exist in the wake of this debate. And Anscombe thinks the ancient philosophers offer us something interesting because they actually thought that it was less important to think about actions, whether that be the actions themselves or the consequences of those actions, and to think about the agent who could perform actions. Instead of thinking about what should I do as a question about what action should I do, you should think about how does what I do reflect who I am. That's enough on Anscombe. Let's return to Aristotle. Cool. So there's what's called in Aristotle the function argument. The function argument is just part of Aristotle's belief around the world. So if you read Aristotle, he actually just reflects on the world and he comes to the function argument, which is necessary to understand his conception of virtue ethics. So Aristotle thinks that all things have a telos. That is, they have a function. This marker here has a function, and its function is to write. To write, like so. It has a function. But I could use this marker as a weapon to hurt someone, right? So the function that this thing was created to do, the function of this thing is to write. But of course, I could possibly use this marker for something against its function, that is to hurt somebody. All things have a function. The word Aristotle uses is telos, and at times we don't translate this word telos because it's actually a word also in English, and it has certain implications for Aristotle's philosophy that are beyond our conversation. This is still called the function argument because why we care about this is because it tells us something about the function of things. All things have a function. What makes an object good, and an object, by the way, includes this marker, animals, me and you as humans, we're all objects according to Aristotle. What makes anything good from the marker to an animal to me is our securing of our telos. It is good for this marker to write. It would be not good. There would not be goodness in me using it as a weapon because that is not what it was created to do. It is not the function of my marker. So all things have a function. And clearly, we can use things for purposes other than their function. But when we do that, Aristotle believes we're doing something that is not good because an object is good when it secures its telos. Aristotle asks himself now, what makes humans different than other objects? This famous question in philosophy exists, which is what separates humans from the animals? And Aristotle answers our ability to reason. This marker here can't reason its way through the function argument. It doesn't have the cognitive capacity to think its way through the function argument and articulate it. I know you can't perhaps see telos here, but know that it says that reasoning is the human function or the human telos. Human is good when we secure our telos. Therefore, a human is good when we reason. Notice from just this first argument of Aristotle's, we've already shifted the goalpost away from action to thinking of ourselves as an object that can be good. The question of what should I do has transitioned from should I do this action to is this the kind of action that makes me good? And of course, Aristotle was not responding to Mill and to Kant. Aristotle lived, he was an ancient Greek philosopher, he lived thousands of years ago. Anscombe, in giving us this argument, notices that what Aristotle has done is focused on the agent instead of focusing on the act. This word gets translated into different words in English in different ways. That's because this word eudaimonia has a lot of different implications. If any of you have ever studied another language or speak another language, you know that sometimes you might translate the same word in another language into two separate words in English, or vice versa. We might have two words in English to describe things, but they have the same word in a different language. Sometimes words don't translate perfectly, and that's because different languages have decided to make different distinctions for different phenomena. And that's fine. But that also means some languages have words to describe very, very specific things that other words don't have to describe. Eudaimonia is like this in Greek. It translates in a few ways. The first way it translates, that obviously seems helpful to us, is it translates to goodness. It's related to something about being good. So a human has eudaimonia when it experiences reason. Also, though, the usual way we translate it, and the author mentions this, is happiness. Also, something like plentifulness, right? So happiness doesn't probably mean what happiness meant in utilitarianism or in hedonism. It actually probably just means something like being content, being happy with your existence. Plentifulness probably means something like fruitfulness. So like this is relevant because part of how he made the function argument make sense in his time was he looked at things and he said, well, some of these things have functions like reproductive anatomy, and these objects are plentiful. That is, they do reproduce when it secures its function, right? So the whole predicate of the function argument, the whole premise, the whole reason he believes the function argument makes sense is because that's sort of the basis of how ideas, as well as people, as well as organisms, are all reproduced. There is some process of reproduction, and when those objects are used in the way that they are, that is a way in which things are plentiful. And this idea of plentifulness in his language is also connected to this idea of goodness, of eudaimonia. This word means all of these things. The last connotation eudaimonia has that's relevant to us is virtuosity. If any of you are clever enough, you've noticed the word virtue is in this word. But virtuosity is also part of this big connotation associated with this word eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is doing a lot here. The goal of ethics for Aristotle is not only reasoning, but the goal that is goodness, the things that we should do, is all caught in to his ideas about what makes us happy, what makes us plentiful, and what makes us virtuous. Aristotle's world, his language, has meant that all of these things are all together working with one another. With eudaimonia, if you don't know what goodness and happiness and plentifulness and virtuosity mean, you can never know what Aristotle means when he says a human is good. You have to know all of these things are part of the word he uses to mean good in order to understand why the function argument makes sense, why he thinks a human is good when it reasons. Already, Aristotle has done a few interesting things. He moved from act to agent, and now his whole reason he cares about agents is also deeply connected to these ideas about functions and virtuousness. So now we have to think about virtuosity, because what we're going to focus on going forward is what makes a human good. Well, now we have this idea of virtuosity. So you have to know what virtuosity is in Aristotle's context. Aristotle thinks that there is a spectrum, and on this spectrum, there are excesses of behavior, which are bad, and there is behavior which is good. These are called vices, and a vice can be a vice of deficiency or a vice of excess. And in between these two vices are the virtues. So let's think of an action. Let's think of anger. I think our book doesn't call it anger, it calls it irascibility. Irascibility is like irrational furiosity at something. Being insanely furious a cruel, angry human being is a vice of excess. But he says, well, what's the opposite of being a person who is insanely angry? What's the opposite of being a person who is absolutely infuriated by everything? It's a lack of spirit at all. It's someone who has no animation to them. And Aristotle says it is just as bad to have absolutely no emotions about anything, to be totally stripped of your emotion. It is just as bad to be that kind of thing as it is to be a person who is encapsulated by their own anger. These things exist on a spectrum where the most excessive type of behavior is someone who is brutishly angry and furious and just this horrible thing. But on the other side of the spectrum, where someone is totally deficient of this quality, is someone who has a lack of spirit. And he says, in between these two vices or virtues, he calls the virtue patience. Some people translate it as slow to anger. The virtuous characteristic in between these two extremes is someone who is patient. They aren't quick to anger. They might get riled up when it is good to be riled up. But that's because they are meeting in the middle. They aren't too angry and furious at the drop of a dime, but they also are not a person who is timid or lacking of spirit. They are instead in the middle of these things, and they are themselves patient and slow to anger because they are virtuous. Virtue exists in between two vices of excess and of deficiency. That is what he thinks virtue is. Let's try another example. We can start with the virtue. So let's say the virtue is courage. We think to be courageous is a good thing. What would it mean to not have enough courage? What would that mean? It would mean something like you are a coward or you have cowardice. Cowardice is like, I don't want to say shyness per se. It is quite shameful. It's not willing to do things because you are afraid or you have fear of the ramifications of doing the right thing, even if you know it's the right thing. It is principally a vice of deficiency, according to Aristotle. Whereas you can imagine someone who's over courageous, someone who is excessively courageous, is sort of like, what's a good word for it? The book here is giving this word named rashness, and that's fine. Over courageous itself, I think, communicates just fine what that word would mean. But you can imagine someone who is too courageous. This, he thinks, is also a vice. Virtuosity is communicating a spectrum still, right? We don't care about the situations that the humans find themselves in. What's important is whether or not the human is good. It doesn't matter what situation the human finds itself in. So if you're in the situation and you can be friendly, a vice of deficiency would be sort of, the situation here is social conduct. So you're thinking about how to conduct yourself in society. The virtue is to be friendly, friendliness to people. Being friendly to people seems to be the virtuous behavior. The vice of deficiency of not being friendly, I think, is something like isolation. The word the book gives is cantankerousness. But these are, at least themselves, vices of being not friendly enough. Whereas the excesses of these things are things like self-serving flattery. I think another good example is something we call virtue signaling. I know virtue is in the word, but virtue is being used differently here. But these are examples where your social conduct, the actual behavior you're taking up, has very little to do with the actions themselves. Let's say you're considering almsgiving, which is like giving money to the poor. There's a homeless person in front of you, and you have to consider if you're going to give money to them. A virtuous person, according to Aristotle, is someone who is generous. And we all think about the word generous, and you're like, you know what? I think a generous person is a good person. A person who is generous is willing to give things to people, but they also understand the limits of their expectations. That's what a generous person is. That's because that's an average of two extremes. One could imagine, I think the word is a person who profligates, but a person who is excessively wasteful with their money. If they always gave all of their money to people and never kept any for themselves to meet their own basic needs, and then relied on other people to be wasteful of their money to take care of their own needs, they were excessively generous, far too generous. They would end up towards a sort of vice of excess. Whereas if someone was not generous enough, they were deficient of generosity, we would say that they are deficient in some sense. And if we back up and remember utilitarianism deontology, a utilitarian says a lot of the times they should do things like you should give all your money to people. That will give the most pleasure to all of them. And people should give money to you to give you the most pleasure. And it's sort of, we excessively have an obligation to give to others. There's also an interesting conversation here going on where some people think that deontology and utilitarianism fit somewhere in this, and virtuosity is a average between them. But remember, virtuosity is trying to just totally strip itself from considering the action itself. So virtuosity here exists as the average of two vices, of deficiency and of excessiveness. That's what virtues are. All of this is baked into our idea of what makes humans good. What should I do? What would a virtuous agent do? The function of humans is to reason. This is true. Part of why that function is the thing we should do is because it is good that we do our function. That is, it's virtuous that we serve our function. Virtue ethics is saying there are people who focus on ends and goals and consequences, and there are people who focus on means and duties and acts. What does a virtuous person do? The virtuous agent is in between these two vices. The debate has become, what is more important in analyzing the ethics of a behavior? Is it the act, the agent, or the consequence? And we're all sort of still figuring this out. Welcome to ethics. This is the place where our field is now that you found us. But that's sort of what Aristotle thought led the discipline of ethics. He sort of thought, just as a matter of his own belief in the world, that things have functions, that it's good that things serve their functions. But when he said the word, it's good, he said it was with eudaimonia that things serve their functions. This is what was valuable about his ethics theory. So that's why we cared about the function argument. And when we looked at the word eudaimonia, it revealed to us this conception of goodness, which is why we translate it this way, but it also revealed these other types of connotations, plentifulness, which is why the function argument became relevant, but also this idea of virtuosity. Baked into Aristotle's idea of what goodness meant was this idea that goodness can be too good or not good enough. And that in the middle of this is what really is good. Excessively good or deficiently good are vices. Virtues are those things which are principally good because they are neither too excessive or deficient. When answering the question, what should I do? The virtue ethicist says you ask yourself, what would a virtuous person do? That's the idea that Aristotle had, that Anscombe identified as important, but also interestingly means that we need to not think about actions themselves. We need to think about how the actions reflect on ourselves, because we are people who are supposed to be balancing these things. Let's think about objections. There are, of course, counterarguments. There are always counterarguments. The first counterargument actually comes from within the field. The objection that I'm going to call unclear guidance, stealing this title from the book, has actually been ever since Anscombe first reopened up this box. Virtue ethicists have been trying to solve ever since. So when we identified what would a virtuous person do, we didn't actually identify who was virtuous. I might imagine that my mom is virtuous because I want to be like her in some way. But that's not a great rule for me to give all people for all time. Virtuosity seems to be hard. The only real thing that carries through in all of virtue ethics is this idea that it is the average or middle between vices of excessiveness and deficiency. It's unclear, the guidance. Some people think this is a good thing. Some virtue ethicists have spent a lot of time and energy trying to isolate exactly what they mean. And there have been virtue ethicists who have articulated, they think, with precision what it is that should guide moral theories. The next thing, which was an issue for clashing duties, is clashing virtues. So remember, there's this issue for Kant and deontology, where it was like both lying and not putting people up to be killed were duties we seem to have, and they clash with each other in the example of hiding Jewish people from Nazis. We imagine this can happen to virtues as well. Someone who is courageous, but is not over courageous, but not too shy, might face an issue where they have to be not withdrawn or isolated, but friendly, but not self-serving and flattery, or alternatively, virtue signaling. Well, let's say they have to be now courageous and friendly, but we're sending them to war to fight for our country. Well, it's hard to be both courageous, that is, get the job done, and imaginably in like a war scenario, that would be to end people's lives, the bad guys, so to say, but at that same time do so in a friendly manner. That kind of brings forth pictures to us that are like silly, but it's like, geez, that's kind of hard. What does a virtuous person do? Responses in virtue ethics is something like, you would hope that that person is not excessively murderous and is not excessively killing soldiers when they don't need to, but you also hope that they don't just let people walk all over them. They think, once again, the virtuous position is somewhere between these two things. But of course, now this person is not friendly, even though we thought friendliness was the virtuous way to conduct yourself in social conduct, right? So these things might clash. The virtue ethicist usually says you can't think about virtues as existing independently and then clashing with each other. But of course, then everything exists in a spectrum of excessive or deficient. The last issue for virtue ethics is that it does rely on a circular argument. Here's how. What makes an act virtuous, right? An act is virtuous if it's the type of thing a virtuous agent would do. What should I do? I should do the thing a virtuous person should do. Well, what do virtuous people do? They do virtuous acts. And what makes acts virtuous is that agents, so there's a circular argument. How virtue ethicists get out of this is they double down on the agent part. They say, no. Virtuous acts are only the things that virtuous people do. Acts themselves are not virtuous because virtuous agents do them. Virtuous acts are just the types of acts that agents are doing, and they try to erase this arrow because they're only virtuous if they're helping serve the function. They're only virtuous acts if they're the type of thing a virtuous agent does. The fact that an agent does them is not because the act is virtuous, that's just what virtuous agents do. But you could imagine some people say you're putting too much pressure on the agent and you aren't thinking enough about the actual acts the agent is doing. Those are the counter arguments. Now I want you guys to start thinking about comparing all of these theories. So that's what we're going to do into this week, going into next week.